my husband and his mother. Thought my paycheck belonged to them. They were wrong about everything. I was still holding my coffee mug when she said it. We were in the living room of the house I had helped purchase. 40% of the down payment, my name on the mortgage, my credit score that made the whole thing possible. And my mother-in-law, Roberta Haynes, was seated in the armchair closest to the window, like she owned the furniture and the floor beneath it, and possibly the air. My husband, Daniel, was on the couch. We had been married exactly 57 days. The paint in our bedroom still smelled faintly of new. I remember that detail because I kept thinking about it. The smell of new things, of possibility, of everything that had not yet been ruined. Roberta folded her hands in her lap and said it without any hesitation at all. She said, "Your salary will go into our account from now on, so we can manage your expenses better." She did not phrase it as a question. She did not soften it with something like "we've been thinking" or "we wanted to discuss." She said it the way someone says the sky is blue or pass the salt, as though the arrangement had already been decided and I was simply being informed of the terms. I set my mug down on the coffee table. I took a breath, and then I gave a slight smile, the kind that uses your mouth but not your eyes. And I said, "That won't be necessary. I earn more than all of you combined." The silence that followed was the kind you feel in your sternum. Roberta's face went through 4 distinct expressions in about 2 seconds. Confusion, then offense, then a recalculation, then the decision to pretend she had not heard me correctly. Daniel, sitting on the couch with his elbows on his knees and his coffee going cold, turned pale. And then he asked me a question that told me, with absolute clarity, what the next several years of my life were going to require. He said, his voice careful, strange, stripped of its usual confidence, "Do you earn more than me? Not how much do you make? Not what do you mean by that? Not, I'm sorry, my mother was out of line. Do you earn more than me?" I looked at him for a long moment. I was 34 years old. I had 2 master's degrees, one in accounting and one in finance, and I worked as a senior forensic financial analyst at a firm in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is one of those jobs that sounds vague until you explain that it means I find money people try to hide, and I am very good at it. I had been very good at it for 8 years. I made $162,000 a year, not counting bonuses, and the year before last my bonus had been $31,000. I did not say any of this to Daniel, not then. I just said yes, and I picked up my coffee mug, and I went to the kitchen, and that was the morning I understood that I had not married a partner. I had married a man who had never once asked me what I earned and had simply assumed, based on nothing, that the answer was less than him. And I had married into a family where that assumption was so fundamental that the mother felt perfectly comfortable sitting in a chair I had paid for, in a house I had helped buy, and telling me my income belonged in their account. That was 57 days in. I would need another year and 4 months before I had everything I needed. But that morning, standing at my kitchen counter in a house that smelled like new paint and bad choices, I began. How does a woman end up there? How does a person who is professionally trained to detect concealment and financial deception end up in a marriage where she failed to apply those exact skills to the man sleeping beside her? I have thought about this a great deal in the years since. The answer, I think, is the same answer it always is, and it is not stupidity, and it is not weakness. It is that we do not look at the people we love the way we look at evidence. We look at them the way we want them to be, and Daniel Haynes, when I met him, was very good at presenting the version of himself he wanted me to see. My name is Margot Voss. I grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina, youngest of 3 children, my father an electrical engineer, and my mother a high school math teacher. I was the kind of child who read financial statements for fun and reorganized my allowance into categories before most kids could spell the word budget. My older brother used to say I was born without the part of the brain that makes you trust what people tell you. He meant it as an insult, but I wore it for a long time as a compliment. In my line of work, it kept me employed. In my marriage, I had chosen, for the first and last time in my adult life, to override it. I met Daniel at a charity event for a children's hospital in Charlotte in the fall, 7 years before the morning Roberta announced her plans for my paycheck. He was tall, charming, good-looking in a practiced, careful way, the kind of handsome that requires effort and maintenance, but reads at a dinner table as effortless. He was in commercial real estate. He told me he had a strong year. He told me Charlotte was a good market. He told me about a building in South End he was managing a deal on that was going to be significant. I listened and found him interesting, and noticed that he asked me exactly 2 questions about my own work, and then steered both of them back to himself within 45 seconds. I noticed that, and I thought it was nerves. I forgave it the way you forgive things in someone you want to like. We dated for a year and a half. During that time, I met Roberta exactly 4 times. Thanksgiving, Christmas, a birthday dinner, and a weekend visit to Greensboro where she and Daniel's stepfather, Gerald, kept a 4-bedroom house they had bought in the mid-90s and paid off with Gerald's pension. Roberta was a woman who described herself as very family-oriented, in a tone that made family sound like a country she was the prime minister of. She was 61 years old, well-dressed, socially exact, and possessed of a particular kind of intelligence that is entirely social. She knew what everyone owed everyone else, and she kept very careful track. She liked me, in those early meetings, in the distant particular way she might like a new appliance that had good reviews. She said things like, "Margot is so accomplished, and Margot has really done well for herself," always in the third person, always with a faint tone of surprise. I did not understand then that those compliments were threat assessments. There were signs I explained away, and I want to be honest with you about that because I think the honesty of it matters. The first time I noticed Daniel's phone behavior, the way he angled the screen, the way he set it face down when I approached, the way he excused himself to take calls that he described vaguely as real estate stuff, I thought it was professional sensitivity. Some deals are confidential. Some clients don't want their negotiations discussed in mixed company. I had my own version of professional discretion. I extended it to him as a courtesy. That was reasonable in the first few months. By the 8th month, when the pattern had not changed and had in fact intensified, I noticed I had stopped asking. Not because I had decided he was honest, because somewhere in the quiet part of my mind, I had already decided that I did not want the answer to the question I could feel forming. And the way you avoid an answer is you don't ask the question. And the way you don't ask the question is you find a reason the question isn't necessary. Work stuff, confidentiality, privacy. These are reasons. They are also, if you are not careful, the mechanism by which you hand someone the right to hide. I was careful about most things. I was not careful about this. There was a weekend in March of our first year dating. We had been together about 5 months. When Daniel went to Asheville with, he said, some guys from his office for a long weekend. He came back Sunday night sunburned on the back of his neck and smelling faintly of something I did not quite place. Something with a floral quality that did not belong to any cologne I knew him to wear. I mentioned the sunburn and he said they had done some hiking and the trail was exposed and he hadn't thought to put sunscreen on the back of his neck. I said that makes sense. I was already reaching for my book. That was the first time I reached for my book instead of asking the question. The second time was in October of the same year, when a woman left a comment on a photo Daniel posted to his social media, a photo of himself at a golf charity event that I had not attended, that said, "Great seeing you last month. You look amazing." I saw the comment. He did not know I saw the comment. I clicked on the woman's profile. She was attractive, early 30s, listed as living in Raleigh. He had not told me about seeing anyone in Raleigh. He had not mentioned Raleigh in the prior month at all. I looked at the comment for about 45 seconds, and then I put my phone down and I thought, it's probably nothing, and I reached for my book. 2 times I reached for the book. Those 2 moments, because what they cost me was 18 months of my life at the rate of daily erosion, daily performance, daily maintenance of a structure I had already half sensed was rotten in the walls. I do not say this to punish myself. I say it because it is the honest accounting of what choosing comfort over information costs, and I was a woman who understood financial accounting in the most literal professional sense, and I still made that trade, and I think most people reading or listening to this have made it too, and I think the reason is the same. We are not afraid of the truth in the abstract. We are afraid of what the truth will require of us once we know it, and sometimes the thing it will require of us feels so large that we choose not to know. I stopped choosing not to know in the living room, 57 days into marriage, when Roberta's folded hands told me that whoever had constructed the story Daniel had told his mother about our life, about what I earned, about what I contributed, about what kind of woman he had married, was not a man who intended to share his life with me in any real way. He intended to have me adjacent to his life, funding portions of it and smoothly explaining others, while the actual life happened in accounts and arrangements and conversations I was not part of. That is when I stopped reaching for the book. Daniel, in the abstract description of him, was not a villain of the operatic kind. He did not shout. He did not diminish me in front of other people in obvious ways. He was, if I am honest, often quite kind in the small daily textures of a life together. He remembered the coffee I liked. He sometimes woke up first and started it without being asked. He made me laugh with a specific kind of dry, absurdist humor that I had always been a sucker for, and which I sometimes, even now, catch myself missing the way you miss a language you once spoke fluently and no longer have occasion to use. The cruelty of what he did was not operatic. It was structural. It was built into the design of things, the same way a house can look beautiful on the exterior and be fundamentally compromised in the foundation, and you can live in it for a long time before the cracks appear in the ceiling and you realize you have been living above something that was never properly built. Roberta was the architect of part of it. I say this without hesitation and with the specific evidence to support it. The Greensboro account, Daniel's name, her address listed as backup contact, opened at a credit union she had banked with since the 1990s, was not something Daniel had conceived alone. The Kannapolis property co-ownership, the rental income, the arrangement by which that income moved between them in ways that did not appear on any tax return I had ever reviewed for our household. Roberta had built that structure with him, or before him, or in collaboration with him, and she had looked me in the eye at Christmas dinner and passed the roast beef and called me dear and kept that structure invisible. She had looked at me in my own living room and told me my salary should go into their account. Not just his, their account. That word, their, is the one that rang in me longest, because it told me that she had always understood the marriage this way, as an arrangement in which I was adjacent to a unit that consisted of herself and Daniel, a unit with its own finances and its own agreements and its own systems, a unit I was being invited to fund but not to join. And the only way that arrangement made sense was if she believed I was someone who could be managed, someone who could be told what to do with her own income and would accept it, would smooth over it, would find a reasonable explanation and reach for the book. She had badly miscalculated what kind of person I was. I think about that sometimes. What she must have thought when Deja's filing arrived, when the 62 pages of supporting documentation included the Kannapolis property records, the rental income calculations, the Greensboro account, her name in the county records as co-owner. I think about what it must have felt like to have believed, for 2 years, that she was managing a situation, and to discover that the situation had been documenting her the entire time. Daniel proposed 14 months after we met, at a restaurant in Myers Park, with a ring that was lovely and a speech that was careful, and a look in his eyes that I read as love, but which I now understand was something more like relief. I said yes because I was 32 years old and because I loved him, or I loved the version of him I had been presented with, and because there is something about a man who appears confident and warm and capable of building a life that is deeply, functionally seductive when you are a woman who has been building her own life alone since 22, and sometimes, in the quiet between the work, feels the loneliness of it settle in your chest like weather. We were engaged for 8 months. In those 8 months, I paid for 60% of the wedding because Daniel said his savings were tied up in deals and he would make it up to me when the commission cleared. The commission cleared. I saw the deposit, $47,000, into the joint account we had opened together. And by the following month it was gone. When I asked, he said expenses. I said which expenses? He said it's complicated, Margot. Real estate deals have a lot of moving parts. I said okay. I said okay because I had decided, consciously, to choose the version of events that let me get married without an argument. And that is the only decision in this entire story that I am truly ashamed of. We moved into the house in Dilworth 2 weeks before the wedding. 1,400 square feet, a craftsman bungalow on a street where people walk their dogs in the evenings and wave to each other, pale gray siding, dark green shutters, a porch where I imagined a life that would never look quite the way I imagined it. The down payment was $112,000. My contribution was $45,000. The rest came from the joint account, from what was supposed to be savings we had built together, but which I would later discover was mostly the commission Daniel had received, and which I had not been fully informed of, because he had held some of it in an account I did not know existed. Not a large amount, not then. About $19,000. But it was the beginning of a pattern I would only recognize in retrospect, the way you can only see the shape of a maze once you have gotten out of it. The morning after Roberta's announcement, Daniel apologized. He came to me in the kitchen after she had gone to her room, and he said she doesn't mean it the way it sounds. She's just old-fashioned. She thinks that's how families do things. He was wearing a gray t-shirt, and he looked tired and slightly rattled, and I watched his face while he explained his mother's worldview to me. And I thought, who are you? Not angrily, just curiously, like the way you turn an object over in your hands and realize you have been holding it upside down this whole time. I said, it's fine. and I meant nothing by it except that the conversation was over. What I had actually understood, in the living room with my mug and Roberta's folded hands, was something that I put into words for myself that same night, sitting at my desk with a glass of water and the particular stillness that settles over you when a decision has already been made without your full conscious participation. I understood that I was married to a man who did not know what I earned. I understood that this meant he had never asked. I understood that in a year and a half of dating and 8 months of engagement and 57 days of marriage, he had not once looked at the finances of our shared life with any genuine transparency or interest in my side of it. He had looked at my contributions when he needed them, which is to say, constantly, and he had looked away from the details, which is to say, deliberately. Roberta had assumed I earned less. That assumption had not come from nowhere. It had come from Daniel, who had allowed her to build her picture of me from whatever he had chosen to tell her, and what he had told her, apparently, was nothing that would have required him to share any power in this marriage. I opened a spreadsheet that night. I called it Home Records. I began logging things. The months that followed were educational in the way that something is educational when you already have the vocabulary and just need the sentences to arrange themselves. I was a forensic financial analyst. I knew what documentation looked like. I knew what the absence of documentation looked like. I knew, with a precision that is almost embarrassing in retrospect, every tool that exists for locating money a person does not want found. I had spent 8 years finding it for courtrooms and attorneys and government agencies, and I knew that the thing about hidden money is not that it disappears. It never disappears. It is only that it moves, and people who move it leave trails, and trails are readable if you know where to look and if you are patient enough to look there. I was patient. Daniel was charming at dinner parties. He was funny at neighborhood block gatherings. He coached a youth soccer team on Saturday mornings in a way that people always mentioned. "Isn't Daniel so good with the kids, Margot? You're lucky." He brought flowers sometimes, the nice grocery store kind, and sometimes he suggested movies, and he was good at holidays, good at birthdays, good at the performances of care that are legible to other people. Roberta called every Sunday morning at 9 o'clock, and Daniel took the call in the kitchen, and I would hear his voice go softer, the way it did around his mother, a quality that is not the same as warmth, but can be mistaken for it. In the first 6 months of marriage, I documented the following, all with dates and screenshots, and in some cases printed copies stored in a folder I kept at my office, which Daniel had never visited and would not have been able to locate without directions. He moved $4,000 from our joint account to an account in his name alone in January. The description in the bank statement said, transfer. No other information. When I mentioned it, casually, over dinner, I said, "Hey, I saw a transfer this week. Do you know what that was for?" He said it was for a deal, a deposit. It'll come back. It did not come back. He had a credit card I did not know about. I found it in March, by accident, when a statement arrived in the mail addressed to him at our address, and I set it on his desk, and then, 2 weeks later, when it was still there, unopened, I opened it. $22,000 in balance. The charges were a mix of restaurant meals, hotel stays, and a recurring charge to a service I did not immediately recognize. A monthly fee of $340 for something called Sweet Stay Preferred, which I looked up that evening and found to be a membership program for extended stay accommodations. I photographed the statement. I put it back on his desk. He never mentioned it. In April, Roberta came to stay for 10 days while Gerald was recovering from knee surgery. She was helpful, in the way that a person can be helpful, while also rearranging your kitchen and commenting on your grocery choices, and telling you, 3 times in 10 days, that Daniel works so hard, Margot. I hope you appreciate it. The 4th time she began a sentence with "I hope you appreciate." I said, "Actually, Roberta, I appreciate Daniel's contributions to our household the same way I hope he appreciates mine." And she looked at me with an expression that was not quite hostility, but was adjacent to it. And then she said, of course, and went to refold the dish towels. What I learned during that visit, by paying the kind of careful attention I reserve for witnesses in complicated financial cases, was that Roberta and Daniel had a system. It was not a spoken system. I never heard them discuss it directly, but it operated with the smoothness of something practiced. When I was in another room, their conversations changed register. Lower. Quicker. When I came back, there would be a micropause and then a resumption of whatever benign topic served as cover. I started noting the timing and the topics. I started noting what questions Roberta asked Daniel when she thought I was not listening. She asked about the deals. She asked about the accounts. She asked about, And I heard this distinctly through the half-open kitchen door on a Tuesday evening. What Margot thinks we have. What Margot thinks we have. I stood in the hallway for a moment with that sentence. Then I went back to the kitchen and made myself a cup of tea and sat at the table, and my hands were completely still and my breathing was absolutely even, and I thought, okay, so that's what this is. By June, I had a picture. It was not yet complete. There were accounts I suspected but had not yet confirmed, income I believed he was diverting that I had not yet traced to a specific destination, and one property I had found in the county tax records that was listed in a variant of his name, Daniel R. Haynes rather than Daniel Robert Haynes, which was either a clerical error or something I was going to need to investigate very carefully, but the shape of it was clear. My husband was concealing financial assets. He had been doing it before we were married. The $19,000 from the commission, the joint account, the down payment math that I had accepted at the time, and which now looked exactly like what it was. He had continued doing it in the marriage. And his mother knew. Not all of it, probably, but enough. She knew there were things I was not being told, and she had approved of that arrangement. And she had sat in my armchair and told me my salary should go into their account, because the safer my money was behind their wall, the harder it would be for me to see what was behind his. I called my friend Deja Williams in late June. Deja and I had been friends since graduate school at UNC. She was now a family law attorney in Charlotte, one of the best, with a particular reputation for complex asset cases. I told her I needed to meet for coffee. She said when. I said as soon as possible. She cleared her Thursday afternoon. We sat at a table at a coffee shop on East Boulevard that she had chosen because it was not near any of Daniel's professional circles, and I put a folder on the table, and she looked at it for about 30 seconds before she looked at me. She said, "How long have you been documenting this?" I said, "Since February." She said, "Margot." I said, "I know." She said, "This is enough to start." I said, "Not yet. I want all of it." Deja is 41 years old, originally from Durham, with close-cut natural hair and reading glasses she wears on a chain around her neck, and a voice that is very calm and very direct, and which has, in my experience, never once adjusted its register for anyone's comfort, including mine. She looked at my folder and she looked at me and she said, "What are you waiting for specifically?" I told her about the property and the county records. I told her about the suite stay membership and the extended stay hotel charges that did not correspond to any business trip I could verify. I told her about a pattern in his phone. I had not looked at the phone itself, but I had seen the screen light up at night, multiple times, in a way that had a rhythm to it that was not work-related. I told her I believed there was another account, somewhere, into which money was being moved in increments small enough to be individually unremarkable, but collectively significant. She said, "I want you to talk to Marcus." Marcus Osei was a forensic accountant who worked with Deja's firm on complex asset cases. He was 46 years old, meticulous, quiet, with a particular gift for reading financial structures the way other people read maps. I had met him twice at legal events. I had always liked his precision. I said, "Set it up." We met with Marcus the following week, a Saturday morning, at Deja's office. He looked at my documentation and asked me 47 questions, each specific, each to the point, none of which were rhetorical. By the end of the meeting, he had a list of 7 financial threads he wanted to pull. He said, "Give me 60 days. I said, "Take 90. I want everything." That summer was strange. I cooked dinner on most weeknights. Daniel and I watched television. We went to a neighbor's 4th of July party, and Daniel put his arm around me, and someone said, "You two, honestly, relationship goals." And I smiled and said thank you and refilled my lemonade. We were performing a marriage I was already dismantling from the inside, and the thing about a performance is that it requires the other person to also be performing, which Daniel was. And neither of us knew that the other one knew, except that I did know, and he did not. The performance had its own exhausting choreography, and I want to be specific about what that meant in the daily texture of those months, because I think people imagine that living inside this kind of situation is a constant high-pitched frequency of anxiety, and it is not. It is more like a very low hum that you become so accustomed to that you stop consciously hearing it, except in the moments when something cuts through. A Sunday morning when his phone buzzes twice in quick succession, and he glances at it and then at me and then away, with the specific micro-expression of someone performing casualness, and you hear the hum again, clearly, and you note it, and you move on. I became very good at moving on in a way that looked like equanimity and was actually strategic patience. In July, I opened a safe deposit box at a branch of my bank on Independence Boulevard, the branch nearest my office, the one Daniel had never visited. I drove there on a Wednesday afternoon on my lunch break, and I filled out the paperwork, and I was handed a small key. I put the key on my keychain, between my office key and my gym card. Daniel saw my keys every single day. He never asked about the new key. He did not know what it was, because people rarely look carefully at the things they do not expect to find anything in. I began moving documents to the safe deposit box, copies of Marcus's findings as they developed. My own spreadsheets, printed and dated. The credit card statement, copies of the county property records, copies of specific financial statements from our joint accounts that I wanted preserved outside the house. I also began keeping a second emergency fund, a savings account in my name only, at a different bank, funded with automatic transfers of amounts small enough to be unremarkable in our joint account, but consistent enough to accumulate, and which would, by January, hold $19,000, which I found grimly appropriate in its echo of the amount he had withheld from me before the wedding. I did not think of any of this as revenge. I thought of it as asset protection, which is precisely what it was, and which is what any competent financial professional would have advised in my situation. In August, Roberta called on a Wednesday, not the usual Sunday, which meant something had prompted it. I heard Daniel's half of the conversation from the upstairs hallway. She was asking about money. I could not hear her words, only the pattern of his responses. Yes, not yet. It's fine. Stop. She doesn't. And then he moved to close the bedroom door, and the rest was muffled. I went back to my home office, and I made a note in my spreadsheet with the date and time and a brief description of what I had observed. That same week, I had a conversation with a colleague at work, a woman named Priya Anand, who had been my closest professional friend since I joined the firm 6 years ago. Priya is 43 years old, originally from Chennai, with a sharp mind and a particular gift for seeing patterns in data that other people miss, which makes her both an exceptional analyst and an exceptional human, to know when you are yourself trying to see the patterns in something. I had not told Priya what was happening. I told her in August, over lunch at a Thai restaurant on East 7th Street, that we had eaten at once a week for years, sitting at the corner table that was always available because the lighting there was slightly harsh and people avoided it, but we liked it for the privacy. I told her the outlines of it, not everything, not the details Marcus was still assembling, but enough. I told her about the LLC discrepancy. I told her about the Greensboro account. I told her about the Kannapolis property. I told her about the credit card and the Sweet Stay membership and the text from Dee. And I told her about the morning in the living room with Roberta's folded hands. Priya did not speak for almost a full minute. She is someone who processes information fully before responding, which I have always respected. And in that minute, I drank my water and watched the street outside and waited. Then she said, "Okay, so what do we do first? Not how are you feeling? Not are you sure? Not have you considered talking to him about it? What do we do first?" Which is why she has been my friend for 6 years and will be my friend for the rest of my life. I said, "We don't do anything yet. Marcus is still working. I need probably another 60 days of documentation, but I needed someone who knows." She said, "I'm here." I said, "I know." She paid for lunch that day and has not let me pay for any of our Thursday lunches since. This is something I have argued about with her, and she simply ignores my arguments, which is one of several things I deeply admire about her. What Margot thinks we have. In September, Daniel had a week-long business trip to Atlanta. He told me about it on a Monday and left on a Thursday. I drove him to the airport at 6 in the morning, kissed him on the cheek at the departure's drop-off, and then drove to my office and called Marcus. Marcus had been thorough. He had been thorough in a way that, professionally, I admired, and personally, made me sit very still at my desk for about 10 minutes, doing nothing but breathing. What he had found, a business account in the name of Haynes Property Consulting LLC, which was a company Daniel had formed 3 years before we met, and which I had known about in the vague way you know about the background structure of a partner's professional life without examining it. The LLC had a business bank account. In the 12 months prior to our marriage, it had received approximately $238,000 in commissions and deal fees. In the same period, Daniel's personal account, the one I knew about, the one we had combined into a joint account when we married, had received approximately $91,000. The gap between $238,000 and $91,000 was not explained by business expenses. Marcus had gone through the LLC's expenses carefully. The business had approximately $60,000 in legitimate deductible expenses. The remaining $87,000 had been moved, in varying amounts over varying intervals, to a personal savings account in Daniel's name alone at a credit union in Greensboro, North Carolina, 30 minutes from Roberta and Gerald's house. It was not lost on me that the account was in Greensboro. Marcus also found the property. It was not a clerical error. Daniel Robert Haynes and Roberta Ann Haynes, my mother-in-law, were co-owners of a small commercial property in Kannapolis, purchased 4 years before our marriage for $212,000, on which there was currently an active lease generating $4,800 per month in rental income. In 2.5 years of marriage, not 1 cent of that rental income had been disclosed to me or entered any account I had access to. I sat at my desk with Marcus's report for 10 minutes. Then I printed 2 copies, put them in separate sealed envelopes, drove to my bank, and put 1 copy in a safe deposit box I had opened in July, in my name alone. The second copy I took home and put in a folder in a shoebox in my home office closet, behind the tax binders from my grad school years. Then I ordered Thai food and watched a documentary about deep-sea fish and went to bed at 10:15. Daniel came home from Atlanta on a Friday evening. He brought me a candle from a boutique hotel gift shop, the kind of gesture that is warm in shape and hollow in content. I thanked him. I put the candle on the bathroom counter. I made a note in my spreadsheet with the date and the words Atlanta trip, unverified, sweet stay charges probable, check credit card statement. In October, he was home more than usual. He was attentive, in a way that felt calculated. Not loving, but strategic. The attentiveness of someone running a diagnostic. He asked questions about my work that he had never asked before. Lighter questions, nothing that would have required him to understand what I actually do, but questions that circled the topic of my income and my professional connections, like something looking for an opening. I answered without detail and changed subjects. He did not push. Roberta called twice in October, both times on weekdays. In November, I made a second meeting with Deja and showed her Marcus's complete report. I also showed her the credit card statement from March, which I had kept. I showed her screenshots of 12 text exchanges I had photographed from Daniel's phone in October, when he left it face up on the kitchen counter and stepped outside to take a call. Conversations with a contact listed as D that referenced on 3 separate occasions things like still have to manage the situation and she's not going to find out, and when this settles we'll move. I had not known what to make of those texts in isolation. In context of Marcus's report, they made very clear sense. Deja looked at everything and she looked at me and she said, "This is wire fraud, Margot. Some of this is actionable in divorce and some of this is potentially criminal." I said, "I want the divorce done right. I want his LLC accounts as marital assets. I want the Kannapolis property accounted for. And I want Roberta's co-ownership documented as part of the asset disclosure." Deja said, "The property will be complicated. She is not your spouse." I said, "She's a co-conspirator on a financial concealment that affected my marital estate. I want that on the record." Deja made a note. I said, "When do I file?" She said, "January. Give yourself the holidays. Let everything settle." I said, "I want to serve him at his office." She said, "Margot." I said, "I want him to be at his desk, in his building, with his colleagues in the adjacent offices, when he finds out." Deja looked at me for a moment. Then she wrote that down too. Christmas was a performance of the first order. We went to Roberta and Gerald's house in Greensboro for 3 days. I brought a bottle of wine I knew Roberta liked, a Napa Cabernet, $62, which I bought because I am not petty about the wrong things. And I sat at her dining room table and ate her roast beef, the co-owners' names in the county record, and I smiled at Gerald's stories and helped clear the table and thanked Roberta for a lovely meal, and said I was a little tired and went to bed at 9:30 on Christmas evening. Roberta said, "She always goes to bed so early," and Daniel said, "She works a lot, Mom." And Roberta said, In that particular tone, that means I have an opinion I have decided not to finish, and I lay in the dark guest room of her house and I thought, 93 days. January 2nd, I went to Deja's office. I signed the filing paperwork. I reviewed the asset disclosure documentation that her team had prepared, which included Marcus's full report, the credit card statements, the LLC business account records, the Greensboro savings account records, the Kannapolis property co-ownership documents, and the text exchange screenshots. It was 31 pages. It was organized with tabs. It was as clean a piece of financial documentation as I had ever produced in my professional life, and I had produced a great many. Deja said, "The service will be Monday." I said, "Monday is good." I want to tell you what I did on the Sunday before that Monday, because I think it matters. I did not pray for courage. I did not second guess. I did not call anyone except Deja, briefly, to confirm the logistics. I made myself a bowl of oatmeal with sliced pear, and I sat at my kitchen table in the house in Dilworth. My house, my mortgage, my name. And I drank my coffee and I read for 2 hours, a novel I had been meaning to get to for months. And then I put on my shoes and walked around the neighborhood for 40 minutes in the January cold and looked at the other houses on the street and thought about what it would feel like to be the only one who actually lived here. Then I came home and I started packing the first box. Monday morning, I was at my office at 8:15. I had a 9 o'clock call with a client that I handled with complete focus. At 11:30, Deja's process server walked into the lobby of Haynes Commercial Real Estate on South Tryon Street in Charlotte, asked for Daniel Haynes, and handed him a sealed envelope. My phone rang 22 minutes later. I let it go to voicemail. Daniel said, "Call me," his voice tight and careful and very controlled, the voice of a man who is in a building with other people and is attempting to feel less afraid than he is. I texted Deja, "Confirm delivery." She texted back, "Confirmed, 11:42. I put my phone face down on my desk and finished my lunch. The calls came throughout the afternoon. 4 from Daniel, 1 from a number I did not recognize, which I later confirmed was a Greensboro area code, which meant Roberta already knew. I answered none of them. At 4 o'clock, I sent Daniel a single text, all communication through my attorney from this point forward. Her contact information is included in the filing. I will be at the house this evening. Please arrange to stay elsewhere tonight. He came home anyway. He came home at 6:15, and I was in the kitchen making pasta, and he stood in the doorway and he looked like something had been removed from behind his face. He said, "Margot," just my name. Like it was a question. I said, "Daniel, you've been served. If you have questions about the filing, you can direct them to Deja Lawson. Her number is in the paperwork." He said, "Can we just talk about this?" I said, "I've been trying to talk about this for a year and a half. We're past talking." He said, "Where did you get all of that information?" I said, "I found it. I'm a forensic financial analyst, Daniel. I find things people try to hide. I'm very good at it. You knew that about me when you married me. I thought about that a lot. There was a silence that was long enough to be genuinely uncomfortable." He said, "Margot, a lot of that is not what it looks like." I said, "All 31 pages?" He said nothing. I said, "I need you to leave now. I'll have the rest of your things packed by the weekend. If you need something specific before then, have your attorney contact mine." He said, "Where am I supposed to go?" I said, "I believe there is a property in Kannapolis that generates $4,800 a month, co-owned by you and your mother. I'm sure she can help." I watched his face go through something complicated. Then I turned back to the stove. He left. I finished making the pasta. I ate it at the kitchen table with a glass of white wine and the novel I had started on Sunday. The house was completely quiet except for the sound of a neighbor's dog somewhere outside and the heat running through the vents. I ate every bit of it. The divorce proceedings were not fast. They were not supposed to be. Deja had built the case to be thorough, not to be quick, because thorough and quick are not the same objective, and in her experience, thorough wins. Daniel's attorney, a man named Philip Reese, who I gathered was expensive, and whom Daniel could, in fact, not quite afford given what was happening to his accessible liquid assets, attempted in February to characterize Marcus's findings as speculation and creative interpretation of legitimate business practices. Marcus was deposed in March. I have never seen anyone deposed with quite that level of documented specificity and calm, which is saying something, because I have seen a great deal of depositions. By the time Philip Reese finished with Marcus's deposition, the creative interpretation argument had been abandoned. Roberta hired her own attorney in February, because Deja had been explicit in the filing that the Kannapolis property and the rental income would be treated as a marital asset that had been deliberately withheld, and that Roberta's co-ownership was documented and would be part of the disclosure. Roberta's attorney, a woman from Greensboro named Carol, sent a letter to Deja arguing that Roberta was not a party to the divorce proceedings. Deja wrote back a very courteous and very detailed letter explaining the specific legal theory under which her client's co-participation in a financial arrangement that directly affected the marital estate was relevant, and enclosed 62 pages of supporting documentation. I never heard from Carol again after that. What happened over the course of those months to Roberta Haynes is this. She had assumed for the entire duration of my marriage to her son that she was managing a situation. She had assumed that the situation was manageable because the key variable, me, did not know what she knew. The key variable knew everything. She had assumed that the armchair in my living room, the folded hands, the tone of benign authority, all of that was backed by something real, some structural power she had over the household, over the finances, over my understanding of my own marriage. It was not. It was backed by my ignorance, and my ignorance had been running out since the morning she created it. By spring, she had lost access to the rental income from the Kannapolis property, because Deja had obtained a court order requiring all income from that property to be disclosed and held in escrow during the proceedings. Gerald, her husband, had learned, from the court documents, because someone had mailed him a copy of the relevant pages, and I will say only that I did not personally mail them. The full scope of the arrangement he had not been informed of, which included an account in Greensboro that Roberta had helped Daniel manage, and which Gerald had not known existed. Gerald was 64 years old, a retired county road engineer, a patient and quiet man who had always struck me as decent, and who had had very little to do with any of this. He was not angry with me. He was angry with his wife. Their marriage did not end, not that I know of, but the Greensboro house was listed for sale in April, and whatever conversations Roberta and Gerald had in that house between January and April, they had them without me. Daniel had taken up residence in a short-term rental in South End. Not, as far as I could tell, the Sweet Stay Preferred program, whose membership he apparently allowed to lapse. The contact in his phone listed as D turned out when her name came out in discovery, during which Daniel's phone records were subpoenaed, to be a woman named Danielle Marsh, 31 years old, a marketing coordinator at a hospitality firm in Charlotte, who had been involved with Daniel for approximately 22 months, which is to say, they had begun their arrangement approximately 10 months after our wedding. I do not know what Daniel told Danielle about his life and his marriage and his intentions. I do know that when the divorce proceedings became public record, Danielle's employer, a firm that did significant work with commercial real estate developers, including some of Daniel's clients, became aware of the situation, and that the subsequent professional complications were, by all accounts, unrelated to anything I did personally. And I know also that Danielle had believed Daniel was going to be in a significantly better financial position than the divorce settlement left him in. I know this because she sent me, in May, a direct message through social media, a long message that moved through several emotional registers, some accusatory, some explanatory, some that appeared to be attempting to establish some kind of alliance or solidarity. I read it twice. I did not respond. I showed it to Deja, who found one sentence in it legally relevant and noted it, and we did not discuss Danielle further. The settlement was finalized in September, 14 months after I had called Deja, and 8 months after I had served Daniel his papers at his office on South Tryon Street. The terms were as follows. The Dilworth house went to me, with a cash buyout that Deja calculated to reflect the actual equity after accounting for the down payment discrepancy from the original purchase. The LLC assets, including the remaining balance in the LLC business account, which Philip Reese had attempted for several months to characterize as non-marital, were included in the marital estate, with my share calculated by Marcus on the basis of what the LLC had earned during the marriage, less legitimate business expenses, less what Daniel had already disclosed. The Greensboro savings account, which had held approximately $64,000 at the time of filing, and which Daniel had attempted to clean out in January before the court order froze it. He had moved $11,000 before the freeze, which was recovered through the legal process, was divided with my portion calculated as marital property. The Kannapolis property's rental income for the period of the marriage was calculated and my share awarded in cash. The total awarded to me, between the house equity, the LLC share, the Greensboro account, the Kannapolis income accounting, and a cash settlement that covered additional documented financial harm, the credit card debt that had been run up on the concealed card, the wedding expenses I had disproportionately borne, was $437,000 net after Deja's fees. I want to be specific about what Daniel lost, because this story deserves the specificity. He lost the house. He had not contributed 40% of the down payment, and his name had always been secondary on the mortgage, because his credit score at the time of purchase had been less robust than his public confidence suggested, a detail I had known at closing and which now was simply documented fact. He lost the LLC assets that he had spent years quarantining from our joint finances under the assumption that what she doesn't know won't hurt her, except that I was a forensic financial analyst, and I found everything, and it hurt him considerably. He lost the Greensboro account, more than half of it, plus the $11,000 he had attempted to move, which he had to repay. He was awarded his portion of the Kannapolis property future income, which he now co-owned only with himself since the co-ownership structure with Roberta had been restructured as part of the proceedings. But he owed Deja's firm a civil judgment related to the financial concealment that put a lien on his share of that income for the following 3 years. His professional life contracted. 3 of his commercial real estate clients, one of them a developer he had worked with for 7 years and who represented approximately 30% of his annual deal income, ended their relationships with his firm during the proceedings, citing the public record of the case and their own business comfort levels. 2 of those clients were companies whose leadership had worked with women professionals in the Charlotte real estate community and who, upon reading the asset concealment findings in the public filing, made their own decisions about whom they wanted doing deals with their capital. I did not contact those clients. I did not need to. The public record did the work. Philip Reese's bill, I was told indirectly through the professional grapevine that connects Charlotte's legal and financial community more efficiently than most people realize, exceeded $40,000, most of which Daniel paid from the LLC account before the court order froze it, and some of which remained in a payment plan arrangement. Daniel was left with the short-term rental, a depleted professional network, an LLC whose business reputation had been complicated by the proceedings, and a real estate market in Charlotte that was, coincidentally, having a difficult year. I moved his remaining things out of the Dilworth house on a Saturday in early October. I boxed them neatly, because I am not a cruel person, only a thorough one. I left the boxes on the porch. I texted him the address and the time window. He sent someone else to pick them up. That evening, I painted the bedroom, the same pale blue I had always wanted and which Daniel had said would make the room feel cold. It does not. It makes the room feel like morning. Roberta's situation, in the year that followed, was its own accounting. The Kannapolis commercial property restructuring removed her from the ownership arrangement, with a cash settlement paid to her from Daniel's share that she and her attorney had negotiated, which meant Daniel's net from that property was further reduced, and Roberta received a lump sum that was less than the continued income would have been worth, and which she would have to pay taxes on as income received. The Greensboro account, which she had served as backup contact for and which Gerald had not known existed, became the center of a private accounting in that marriage that I was not privy to and did not need to be. What I know is that by the spring after the proceedings, the Greensboro house was listed for sale at $480,000. It sold in June. I know this because the county property records are public. Roberta's standing in the Greensboro community, the church she attended, the garden club she belonged to, the long-running social architecture of a woman who had spent 40 years building influence through proximity and information, did not collapse publicly. I had not sought that and would not have engineered it if I could. But people in closed communities know things, and the county court records are accessible, and several people in that community had professional relationships in Charlotte, and the shape of what Roberta had participated in was readable by anyone with the motivation to read it. Whether they read it, and what they did with what they read, was not something I ever tracked. It was not my business. My business was my marriage, and my marriage was resolved. What was her price? I have been asked this in various forms by people who wanted the operatic version. Roberta humiliated publicly, Roberta confronted, Roberta delivering an apology in some scene of reckoning. The truth is more structural and more permanent. She lost the Kannapolis income stream. She lost the Greensboro account arrangement. She lost whatever leverage and control she had believed she held over her son's household, because that household no longer existed in the form she had managed. With coffee and a croissant and the right color, finally, for the bedroom of my own house. I moved his remaining things out of the Dilworth house on a Saturday in early October. I boxed them neatly, because I am not a cruel person, only a thorough one. I left the boxes on the porch. I texted him the address and the time window. He sent someone else to pick them up. That evening, I painted the bedroom. I want to tell you what the following year looked like, because I think the year after is where the real story is. Not the confrontation, not the settlement, not the packed boxes. The real story is in the ordinary Tuesday evening when you realize you have not braced yourself before opening the front door. The real story is in the grocery store at 7 o'clock at night when you buy exactly what you want and nothing you don't, and there is no one waiting at home to weigh in on the proportions. The real story is in the morning when you wake up and the first thought in your head is genuinely, neutrally yours. I am 36 years old now. I live in the Dilworth house, the pale blue bedroom, the dark green shutters, the porch. I have a dog, A 3-year-old rescue mutt named Quince, brown and small and extremely opinionated, who sleeps at the foot of the bed and takes up considerably more space than his size would suggest. I work at the same firm, though I was promoted to principal analyst in the spring, with a salary that I will describe only as significantly more than $162,000, and let you do the math. I have a small vegetable garden in the backyard that produces, in summer, more tomatoes than any one person can reasonably use, and I have spent a not insignificant amount of the last year learning to make things with them. I want to describe for you what a specific, ordinary morning looks like now, because I think ordinariness is underrated in this kind of story. Everyone wants the climax, the confrontation, the settlement numbers, the packed boxes, but the thing that the marriage stole from me that I most wanted back was not any single dramatic thing. It was the ordinariness, the Tuesday mornings, the specific quality of a day that belongs entirely to itself and not to any performance. This is a Tuesday morning in April, 6 months ago. I wake up at 6:15 because Quince has decided it is time, which it is not, but he is persistent and his nose is cold, and eventually I give up and we go downstairs. I make coffee, the good kind, from a small batch roaster on East Boulevard, beans I buy on Saturdays, and grind fresh every morning, because during the marriage I had switched to whatever was easiest and cheapest, because I was managing so many other things, and now I have given myself back the coffee. It is a small thing. It is not a small thing. While the coffee brews, I stand at the kitchen window and look at the backyard, where the first tomato seedlings I started inside in February are now in the ground and showing the tentative green of things that are not yet sure they will succeed. The morning light is the particular pale gold of early April, the kind that exists for about 40 minutes before it shifts into the fuller white of proper daytime, and the air through the cracked window smells of damp soil and the neighbor's lilac bush and the faint iron smell of morning. Quint sits beside me and we both look at the garden with what I can only describe as shared satisfaction. I drink my coffee at the kitchen table with the newspaper, the actual paper newspaper, because I canceled my various digital subscriptions during the marriage when Daniel kept asking why we needed them, and when I reinstated them after, I also added back the paper, which I had missed without quite knowing it. I read it for 45 minutes. No one calls. No phone buzzes with anything requiring management. The house is exactly as quiet as I want it to be, and the quiet is mine. At 7:30, I shower and dress and drive to the office, and the route takes me past the coffee shop on East Boulevard, where Deja and I met in the summer before I filed. I do not think about that meeting every time I pass. I used to. Now I sometimes think about it and sometimes think about entirely other things, which is how you know that the past has taken its proper size. That is an ordinary morning. That is what I got back. Deja and I have lunch on the last Thursday of every month. She is working on a case involving a real estate developer in the Lake Norman area, and occasionally mentions details she can mention and asks, half joking, half professionally, what I would be looking for if I were her. Marcus and I have worked together twice more since the settlement, on cases for other clients of Deja's firm, and he remains the most precise person I have ever encountered in a professional context, which is saying something about the field we are in. My brother in Raleigh, the one who used to say I was born without the part of the brain that makes you trust, calls more often now. He and his wife came to visit in August, and we sat on the porch in the evening, and he said, "I'm really sorry about Daniel." And I said, "I'm not." He looked at me for a moment, and then he laughed. And then I laughed. The kind of laugh that is warm and real and not performed for anyone. Priya and I still eat Thai food at the corner table on East 7th Street every Thursday. She still pays, and I still argue about it, and she still ignores me. Last month she told me she was going to buy a house in Plaza Midwood and asked if I would look at the contract with her. And I said, "Always," and she said, "You know what I love about you?" And I said, "My forensic financial training." And she said, "Among many things," and we both laughed, and I paid for lunch finally, because I had told the waiter ahead of time and given him my card before she arrived, and she was deeply annoyed, and it was a perfect afternoon. I have not spoken to Daniel since October of last year, when he sent a text that I read and did not answer. I have not spoken to Roberta since Christmas in Greensboro, which is now more than a year and a half ago, and I do not anticipate that changing. Gerald sent me a card, a regular note card, handwritten, brief, that said only, "I'm sorry, Margot, and I want you to know I didn't know. I believe him." I sent back a note that said, "I know, Gerald, thank you." That correspondence is complete. There is a man I have been seeing, cautiously, since February. He is 40 years old, a structural engineer, with a particular way of listening to things that suggests he is actually listening rather than waiting to respond, which is not as common as it should be. We have had dinner 6 times and walked his very large dog in Freedom Park twice, and had one conversation about property tax assessments that was genuinely enjoyable to both of us, which tells me something important about compatibility. I have been transparent with him about the divorce and about what it took. He listened to all of it without flinching and then said, "That sounds like it required a lot of precision." And I said, "It did." And he said, "That tracks." And I said, "Does it?" And he said, "Yeah, you're the most precise person I've ever met in a good way." And I said, "In a good way" is doing a lot of work in that sentence. And he laughed. The right kind of laugh for the right kind of man. I am not building anything fast. Fast was how I got into trouble the first time. Not because I moved quickly in the chronological sense, but because I chose comfort over clarity, and speed and clarity are not the same thing. This time I am building slowly and with my eyes open. And I am in no hurry. And the difference between the two feels like the difference between the first apartment I rented out of grad school. Functional, adequate, not really mine. And the house in Dilworth, which I chose and paid for and painted the right color. What I have learned, and I am saying this not as a lesson someone taught me, but as a thing I extracted slowly from my own experience. The way you extract something lodged deep, carefully, without damaging the surrounding tissue. The first thing is that your instincts are not imaginary. When you notice something, that noticing is information. It is not sensitivity, and it is not paranoia, and it is not being difficult. It is data. Treat it as data. Write it down. Date it. Give it the same respect you would give any observation you made in a professional context, because your life is at least as serious as anyone's professional context. The second thing is that documentation is not revenge. Documentation is protection. It is the thing that stands between you and a version of events that someone else will try to impose on you. The person who moves money quietly is counting on the absence of documentation. The absence of documentation is your exposure, not your peace. The third thing is that the people who know and stay silent are making a choice. Roberta made a choice. Danielle made choices. The mutual friends who knew Daniel was spending time with Danielle and said nothing to me. They also made a choice. People who protect someone else's deception with their silence are not neutral. They are participants. You do not owe them the charitable interpretation they have not earned. The fourth thing is that silence organized on your behalf is not the same as forgiveness organized on his. After the settlement, several people in our mutual social circle reached out to me. A neighbor who had watched our marriage from 100 feet of shared street who said she'd always sensed something was off. A couple we'd been to dinner with 6 times who said they hoped I was doing okay. A woman from the neighborhood 4th of July gathering who had once told me relationship goals, who sent me a text saying she felt terrible about that. I was polite to all of them. I was not warm in a way that required anything of me. What they had or hadn't sensed and kept to themselves was their business. What they did or didn't know and chose not to share was also their business. I was not in the business of managing their guilt about what proximity to my situation had cost them in retrospect. My energy was for my life, not for soothing the discomfort of bystanders. The fifth thing is this, and it is the most important. You are not required to manage the emotional consequences of someone else's dishonesty on their behalf. You are not required to keep the secret. You are not required to make it clean or quiet or easy for anyone who constructed a situation that was none of those things for you. What you owe the truth is your participation in it, which means saying it clearly, at the right time, to the right people, with evidence in hand. The woman who walked into that living room on a February morning, 45 days into marriage, with a coffee mug and a slight smile, is still me. She is more me than she was then, actually. The marriage compressed something in me, not broke it, not destroyed it, but pressed it into a smaller space than it belonged in, the way you can press a document into a binder, and it is still the same document but folded into a shape that is not its natural shape. What happened afterward was the unfolding, slow, deliberate, with care for what was already there. A year ago this month, I stood in my kitchen and held a piece of paper the size of my palm, and I did not cry, and I did not shake. I set the receipt on the counter, and I took a photo of it, and I went to make coffee. I was 34 years old. I had been married for 57 days, and from that morning, everything I did was a preparation. Everything I do now is the life I was preparing for. Every morning with the good coffee, every Thursday lunch with Priya at the corner table, every Saturday at the farmer's market with a bag of whatever looks best, Every evening with Quince at my feet and the pale blue walls of my bedroom, and the house that is mine, entirely, without negotiation or performance or the low constant hum of a lie being maintained. The receipt, the folded hands, the question, "Do you earn more than me?" asked in a voice that expected a different answer. Yes, I do. I always did. And what I earned, what I built, what I documented and protected and reclaimed, that was always going to be mine in the end. Because I was always going to be someone who found what was hidden. I was born without the part of the brain that makes you trust what people tell you. My brother was right. It saved me everything. If this story woke something in you, if at any point while you were reading or listening you thought, "I know this feeling," or "I know this silence," or "I know what it is to watch someone build a version of events," and know it is wrong but not yet have the words or the evidence to say so, leave your comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what landed. Tell me what part of this you're carrying. And if you know someone who is making excuses for a person who stopped deserving them a long time ago, someone who says maybe I'm overreacting, or maybe I'm wrong, or maybe if I just wait, share this video. Because sometimes we need to see that it is possible, that you can find out, that you can prepare, that you can walk away with everything you are owed, legally and emotionally and completely. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell. We tell stories here about women who decided the truth was worth more than the comfort of not knowing, who decided that the life they were living was not the only life available to them. You don't owe anyone silence about what they did to you. A strong hug, and I'll see you in the next one.